Charlie is from Camborne School of Mines, University of Exeter, and he's going to take us back to Africa. Yeah. So,
thanks for those that have stuck around until this last session before lunch. Hopefully the microphones won't pick up my stomach rumbling. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about a little bit of what I've been working on recently in my PhD, using the platinum group elements and gold to try and trace some of the petrogenic processes of alkaline ultramafic rocks of the Kaapvaal Craton. So I'm going to very quickly whiz through some classifications just so there's a bit of context here. So first rock I'm going to be talking about are aurangites. So aurangites are igneous rocks that contain over 90% mafic minerals. They're typically inequigranular and contain phlogopite and olivine as phenocrystic and macrocrystic phases, and often have primary carbonate. And differentiation between aurangites and kimberlites. So they used to be grouped under the same umbrella, and aurangites were micaceous versions of kimberlites. Then they were called group 2 kimberlites. These two terms aren't really used anymore. And at the moment, it's kind of like a three-way battle between those. And for each today, I'm just going to use the word aurangiite because I quite like it. And we're talking about aurangites that are from the Western Bushveld. Second rock type I'm going to talk about is a lamprifier. And again, I'm just going to whiz through those first classification steps. I'm talking about alkaline lamprifiers today, and specifically Comptonites. And essentially, these are just types of lamprifier dikes that have a feldspar-dominated ground mass, and are their phenocrystic phases are dominated by titanium-rich amphiboles. And yeah, the lamprifiers I'm talking about today are from the Greenview site. All you really need to know about these two rocks is they are both different types of small volume, volatile, and incompatible rich igneous intrusive rocks, and they form through low degree partial melting of variably metasomatized mantle sources. So here's just some locality maps to give some context. On the left-hand side, we have the distinctive western limb of the Bushveld complex, and we have this almost 45-kilometer long dike swarm of aurangiite intrusions around the Rustenburg area, and these are all Mesozoic in age. And then on the right-hand side, about 100 kilometers to the east, near the city of Pretoria, between Pretoria and the famous Premier kimberlite, we have these sites near Greenview and Francebourg, where we have outcropping of these alkaline lamprifier dikes. So it's really important to understand the petrology of these rocks in order to see how the PGEs differ between the two M members. So aurangites sit along a spectrum between evolved and unevolved. The unevolved M members essentially represent a primary magma that is entrained lithospheric mantle material, and that's represented by these large rounded olivine macrocrysts that are essentially disaggregated prototypic mantle, and so they're xenocrystic in origin. The two photos on the right-hand side are two more evolved M members, and they range in their textures between porphyritic, where we have these euhedral olivine phenocrysts, and aphanitic samples, which are completely devoid of olivine and are just composed of phlogopite, clinopyroxene, and apatite, essentially. So we're going to move on to talking about the bulk rock platinum group element compositions of these rocks. So on the left-hand side, just have a normal primitive mantle normalized plot, just to show the variability in the PGE systematics for these rocks. And you can see there's quite a high degree of variability, and generally quite low total PGE concentrations, maxing out at about 13 ppb for some samples, but that is quite enormously high. And we have variation between very fractionated PGE patterns, shown by these quite steep profiles with depletion in the IPGEs. And we also have some rare occurrences of more negatively sloping patterns, where we have an actual enrichment in the IPGEs over the PPGEs. But generally, there is quite a high degree of internal coherency for these rocks, where we have the bulk of the samples plotting with moderately sloping, but basically flat profiles, and relatively unfractionated. Comparing the Bushveld aurangites to aurangites from other cratons around the globe, you can see they're typically quite depleted in the IPGEs and have average to low PPGE content and significantly lower gold than aurangites from other cratons. So these rocks are formed by very low degrees of partial melting. We're talking probably less than 2% sort of fraction melting, and rocks of this melting of this lower degrees are very unlikely to entrain to obviously exhaust any sulfide in the source. And we don't see a huge amount of iridium in these rocks, as you can see on the plot on the right. It's basically under 1 ppb. But if we're assuming that a melt below 2 degrees of partial melting is only going to contain iridium at around 0.05 ppb, we're still seeing almost an order of magnitude higher iridium content in these rocks than would be expected. You can see obviously that the petrogenetic mantle is much higher MgO content, and also is much higher in terms of its iridium content. And so it's been thought in the past that you can use iridium contents of the bulk rock iridium contents of the aurangites as a proxy for olivine or entrainment of the lithospheric mantle. But it becomes more interesting when we break the rocks down into their mineralogical end members. The evolved samples, so that's the samples that are containing over 5% in their volume of olivine macrocrysts, which is representing our disaggregated proteolytic mantle. They have very coherent patterns, generally very flat and unfractionated, and other than this one sample that has a slight depletion in platinum, very consistent. Now our evolved samples, which are the samples that don't contain any clear, observable, disaggregated mantle material, they have extremely variable PGE systematics, ranging from highly depleted profiles that highly fractionated profiles that we've seen, and also one sample that does have this IPGE enriched signature. So what are the possibilities to achieve the bulk rock PGE signature that we've seen? Because we know that there's more PGEs in these rocks than there should be, considering they're such low degree melts of the lithospheric mantle. So we know these rocks entrain olivine from the lithospheric mantle, and perhaps this is our source of the higher IPGE signature. So if we're entraining sort of variable abundances of olivine that may have iridium-rich or relatively iridium-rich base metal sulfides included, and we're entraining them and disaggregating them and assimilating them, perhaps that's where we're getting our higher IPGE, PPGE signature from. Perhaps in this lithospheric mantle source, which has been highly metasomatized, likely by subduction-derived fluids, perhaps in these strange oxidizing and volatile-rich environments, sulfides or PGM are broken down into the melts far more efficiently than is expected. Or during the highly volatile eruptions that are associated with kimberlites and aurangites, perhaps, via processes like CO2 fluxing, perhaps we're actually physically entraining dense sulfide and bringing it down from the lithosphere up into the crust. So I'll start off just quickly by talking about the unevolved signatures. So following on the iridium modeling that Wolf has done for kimberlites in Finland, we've applied the same model to our dikes here. So on the left-hand side, we have the dike signature. So that's the bulk rock PGE signature that we measure. And if we're assuming that any iridium in these rocks above 0.05 ppb is foreign, we can calculate that in order to achieve the PGE signature that we actually get when we measure our rocks, you'd have to entrain and disaggregate between around 6 and 19% of Kaapvaal lithospheric material. And then essentially we can minus that profile from our original profile to come up with what would be a sort of best guess for the PGE contents of the primary melt. And other than the one profile that is significantly depleted in platinum palladium, for the PPGEs, there's a fairly high degree of coherency there. It's just for the IPGEs that are much more variable. And of course, some of the limitations here, there's no value for osmium. And because of our low osmium iridium ratios in our rocks, osmium, the model gives us negative numbers for osmium there. And we can observe the macrocrystic content of these rocks through our petrological studies, and very typically they range between 5 and 20% volume of entrained mantle material, and that matches up really well with the 6 to 19% there that we get from this iridium model there. So maybe that the end game PGE signature for these unevolved rocks is simply just disaggregating and entraining proteolytic mantle material. We may be getting actually too much palladium and platinum here for rocks that are derived from those low degrees of melting, and that might come back to relate to the accessibility to the sulfides and the PPGEs to the melting in the source. So the weird signatures that we get for the evolved aurangites. So these are the samples that contain very little or mostly zero olivine macrocrysts. We have this high IPGE signature that somewhat mirrors the trends displayed by the average Kaapvaal prototypes. So perhaps we're still seeing we're still seeing the signature of the lithospheric mantle, but in a much more cryptic phase. We're not observing olivine in this sample specifically. So perhaps the lithospheric mantle PGE signature is actually represented by more cryptic ground mass sulfides or PGMs that we haven't been able to pick up on. Or perhaps that, so if these more fractionated patterns might be explained by the fractionation of olivine. So if we're starting off with highly fractionated initial patterns, which are relating to, of course, the compatibility of iridium and osmium, so they're staying in the source. And as we're slowly melting incongruently sulfides in the source, we're starting to get a higher PPGE content in our melt. Then we start to entrain lithospheric mantle material and essentially start to slowly upgrade potentially our IPGE budget. And then as the olivine fractionates out and as we lose olivine macrocrysts from these rocks, perhaps we're dropping back down to have more fractionated patterns. Or maybe we're actually seeing, some sort of the primary signature in these rocks still, and it's actually representing incongruent melting of the sulfides in the mantle. So when we move on to other rocks that clearly don't contain variable proportions of lithospheric mantle, such as these lamprifiers. So these are aphanitic porphyritic, so don't contain any olivine macrocrysts. So you'd maybe assume that the PGE contents of these rocks best represent the source because they're not going to have as much lithospheric mantle contamination, essentially. And these are the systematics for the Greenview lamprifiers. And you can see when comparing to lamprifiers from the Kaapvaal Craton, they are highly depleted again in IPGEs and actually generally depleted across the board for the PGEs. And again, so this may just represent because these are such low degrees of partial melting, where the osmium, iridium, and ruthenium is retained in the source, and any PGE that's going to be entrained into our melt is going to be PPGE. We can, of course, apply the same models of lithospheric mantle, the iridium proxy models that we talked about before, and so potentially up to 2% volume of entrained mantle material would explain the iridium and PGE content of these rocks. But it's more likely that it's much that's to do with the state of the source and how accessible and the way that we transport base metal sulfides and PGEs in these very strange rocks. So some summaries there. So the systematics range quite widely between fractionated and unfractionated PGE patterns for the bushveld orangites. For the macrocrystic orangites, perhaps we've got a good explanation for this. It's to do with a 16 to 19% contribution from the lithospheric mantle, or actually it's to do with, like we're talking about, it's more efficient transfer, whether it's chemical or physical, of sulfide or PGE in the source, or more cryptic phases. The alkaline lamprifiers are much more likely to represent simple, the highly metasomatized state of the source. Now, I didn't include the sun there, but it's just a thought and maybe don't want to overstep, but because the orangites and the lamprifiers from this location are much more PGE depleted than we see from any other craton, perhaps that's just simply part of the source and maybe due to some sort of vague post-bushveld depletion of PGEs and lithospheric mantle, but I don't want to overstep there. Thank you.
Sure. Probably got time for one or two quick questions. Yeah.
I have many questions, but I think I should choose one. Okay. In terms of cost of the PGEs, because you're doing whole rock PG analysis, if you do duplicate or triplicate analysis, then that will give you what kind of cost basis you might have in your rock. Did you do that?
I think some of the samples were duplicated, but in terms of the specific host of the PGEs, I don't think there's been a huge amount of work on in general on where the PGE would sit within these rocks. They do have disseminated ground mass sulfides, but I don't think there's been any in situ work or anything like that to determine where the actual PGE signature is within these rocks.
Okay. So do you do duplicate analysis, and do you see any differences between?
So there's some samples that are, we have a couple of dikes that represent sort of like polyphase intrusions, and there's been analysis taken from different sections of these dikes, and they often do have quite different PGE signatures.
Okay. Wolf, do you want to say anything about lunch and when you
Yes,
want to?
very briefly, we should be back at 1:45. That's the first thing. Second thing, Finland excursion people, you can corrupt the field guide. And third thing, I forgot what I wanted to say. I will say something about the dinner after when we come back from lunch. Oh yeah, posters. There are still a few spaces free for posters. So if you're not in today's session, you can still put up your poster. There's a couple of free spaces.
My passport and stuff.
Yes, I have received that by email.
No rush, just.
Are we missing people there still? Or no, who's in charge?